I am Joshua Rivera, and this is my presentation on Romanov Russian imperialism and the Eurasian impact, covering the years from 1600 to 1900. So this presentation will be divided into three distinct sections and time periods, each covering roughly a century. First, the years 1600 to 1700 will discuss early Russia and its eastern expansion. Second will be the years 1700 to 1800, which will discuss Russia's expansion into Europe and the Caucasus. And lastly, the years 1800 to 1900 will discuss Russia's expansion into Central Asia and further consolidation of its territories. There will also be a section at the end that discusses the modern impact of Romanov imperialism that we can still see today. Now, before starting, a term that will appear a bit later on in the second section, and much more importantly in the third section, will be defined. Russification. So the term Russification refers to a policy or policies that intended to assimilate non-Russians by making them adopt Russian culture and Russian language. Methods would include making the official language of governance in a region the Russian language, forcing populations to adopt Orthodox Christianity, and Cyrillicizing local languages, or forcing a non-Russian language to adopt the Russian Cyrillic alphabet. This term will become important during the late 1700s and especially during the 1800s. Now first, we will discuss early Russia and its expansion eastward, all events that occurred between the years 1600 and 1700. King Michael, or Mikhail Fedorovich, was the first Romanov. He was coronated in the year 1613. This is the beginning of the Romanov dynasty, which would last over 300 years, ending in 1918 when Tsar Nicholas II and his family was executed by Bolsheviks during the Russian Civil War. Russia had been expanding into Siberia, the Asian portion of modern Russia, since the late 1500s. The expansion was due to claims on all of the Khanate of Sibir's land, which was an ambiguous definition for a land claim, and also to spread Orthodox Christianity. Some parallels can be drawn between the settling of Siberia to that of America's manifest destiny, primarily the spread of Christianity. Russia would finally reach the Pacific Ocean when Ivan Moskvitin arrived on the Sea of Okhotsk in 1639. This map here labels the territory gained by Russia under each ruler and time period. The land specifically gained during the time period being discussed right now would be all the land in brown, with some of the western brown land having already been settled prior in the 1500s. The Council Code, Sobornoye Uloženie, was instituted under Alexis Romanov, which, besides being a set of new laws, also established the legal practice of serfdom. Serfdom was not quite like slavery, as serfs had their own freedoms, and serfs were instead bound to land rather than being owned to a specific person or by a specific person. It was more like some form of indentured servitude. This legal binding to land meant that serfs were forced or obligated to conduct agricultural labor on the land and pay a portion of the harvest to the lord of the land. The binding also meant that serfs could not leave, marry, or change occupations without explicit permission from the lord whose land they were bound to. Now, the Russo-Polish War, also known as the Deluge, and the Second Northern War, both occurred around the mid-1600s and had some overlap. Russia would go to war with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth as well as Sweden, and the outcomes of the wars would grant Russia land in the Baltics as well as both land and influence over Eastern Europe in general. Following this would be the Russo-Turkish War from 1676 to 1681. Russia would conquer more land in southern Ukraine and would secure land in the steppes of the Caucasus from the Ottoman Empire. This war established the area of interest between the two powers in the region at the Dnieper River. Zaporizhian Cossacks would play a role in the wars. They would be supported by Russia, but on occasion would go against Russia. Over time, the Cossacks would be gradually stripped of autonomy and eventually integrated, as Russia did not support the self-governance or autonomy of the Cossacks. Russia's further expansion into Europe and the Caucasus. All events between the years 1700 and 1800. The city of St. Petersburg was built on the Baltic coast from lands gained from the previous war with Sweden. The city was built by serfs, conscripted all across Russia, and thousands would die from the harsh conditions during construction. It was made the state capital of Russia in 1728, and remained the capital until 1918 when the Bolsheviks reinstated Moscow as the capital. The Treaty of Nystad in 1721 would grant the Russians land in the Baltics and Karelia, today comprised of Estonia and parts of Latvia. As you can see on the map, the land that was included the town of St. Petersburg, which was being built. Leadership of the Baltic provinces would be dominated by the Baltic German minority, as they owned a majority of land and businesses in the region. The Lutheran faith would be preserved and maintained, and overall the Baltics would be spared from Russification programs throughout their history under the Russian Empire. The greatest extent of Russification in the region would perhaps be how some Baltic German institutions were targeted. The Persian campaign of Peter the Great took place during the years 1722 and 1723. The significance of these campaigns was the increase of Russian influence over the Caucasus, which sought to counter and limit Ottoman influence and gains in the region. As for territorial changes, Russia would gain land in the Caucasus from Iran, however, would return all of the territories after 12 years. After a war with the Ottoman Empire, Russia would vassalize Crimea, and eventually, in violation of the Treaty of Kyushu-Kyanarji, Russia would conduct the first annexation of Crimea. Policies of de-Tatarization would be imposed, characterized by expropriating land owned by Tatars and assigning land to Russian nobles. After the Russo-Turkish War of 1787 to 1792, the Treaty of Jassy would recognize Crimea as being under Russian rule. This would lead to a massive exodus of Tatars from Crimea, with the estimated population dropping from around 300,000 originally down to 170,000. The third partition of Poland occurred in 1795, which would end Polish-Lithuanian statehood. The remaining Polish-Lithuanian lands were divided amongst its three neighbors, Russia, Prussia, and Austria. This would be the beginning of Russification of the Poles, as Russian language, culture, and Orthodox Christianity would begin to be enforced in the region. The last segment, from 1800 to 1900, will discuss Russia expanding into Central Asia and consolidating its territories. Specifically, we're going to be discussing the further consolidation of territories, Russification. This is the peak of Russification. Russia conducted a collection of wars for conquest and Christianization of the Caucasus. One of the most notable atrocities to occur to the local population would be the Circassian genocide during the Russo-Circassian War. What occurred was the systematic ethnic cleansing of Circassians, and Russian soldiers were given permission to conduct mass killings and mass rapes of Circassians. This resulted in the killing and displacement of 95 to 97% of the Circassian population at the time. This created a significant Circassian diaspora, as today there are more Circassians living abroad than within Russia, with 2 to 3 million living in Turkey, which is roughly half of the total Circassian population today. Polish and some Lithuanian rebels would revolt in 1863 for semi-autonomous status within Russia. The revolt would fail, and Russia would punish the local populations. 20,000 Poles were exiled to Siberia, with 60,000 people in total being exiled from Poland. Serfdom was abolished a couple years prior, and its abolishment would be used to justify the confiscation of various estates in Poland and Lithuania. Taxes would also be increased on all estates in both regions. This revolt would begin a new momentum for Russification policies. In particular, this revolt would begin a new momentum for Russification policies. In particular, the Polish language was removed from the education system. The Uniate Church would be liquidated, and Cyrilization attempts would be made on the Polish language. The Pale of Settlement was established in 1791 and would last until 1917, when it was abolished by the provisional government during the Russian Civil War. The Pale of Settlement isolated Jews from representation in Russia, as significant numbers of Jews were forcibly relocated and confined to the Pale. These relocations would happen during the 1800s, especially. Further exclusions included not just physical but economic exclusions, as Jewish merchants were prohibited from trading with areas outside of the Pale. By 1835, over 4 million Jews were living within the Pale, and would remain in the Pale until the aftermath of the Second World War, as the Jewish community drastically suffered under Nazi occupation of the Soviet Union. The borders of the Pale cover parts of modern-day Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, or specifically Latgalia, Ukraine, and some Western Russian territories, while completely covering the territories of modern Belarus and Moldova. We can see some examples of Russification during Russia's wars for expansion in Central Asia. Starting the year 1864 with the invasion of the Kazakh Khanate, Russia would encourage Kazakhs to settle into fixed-place agricultural jobs in an attempt to replace their nomadic lifestyles. However, not all Kazakhs would give up their way of living. Next was the invasion of Bukhara and Kakand. Kakand's leaders would be executed and their land directly integrated into the Russian Empire as the Fergana Oblast. Bukhara would instead be turned into an imperial protectorate, which had some autonomy within the Russian Empire. Khiva would fall to a similar fate, not being annexed but instead becoming a protectorate with some level of autonomy. The conquered regions would be grouped under an administration called Turkestan, which was administered as a krai. A krai is legally the same as an oblast, with the name instead denoting that the area is at the edge of the Russian state's borders. Here's a map of Russian Turkestan around the year 1900. The land Turkestan covers includes modern-day Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and parts of Kazakhstan. The Russo-Turkish War of 1877 further established Russian influence and power projection in Europe, particularly over the Balkans. Russia would force the Ottomans to give independence to Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro, and Russia would take land in present-day Georgia. Armenians would view the Russians as liberators due to oppression from Ottoman rule. Around 100,000 people, primarily Muslims, would leave the lands annexed by Russia towards the Ottoman Empire. Various Christian minority groups, particularly ethnic minorities from other parts of Russia, would be encouraged to migrate to Georgia, as well as into the Caucasus in general, as part of Christianization. The February Manifesto, passed in 1899, would begin the Russification of Finland by ending Finland's autonomous status as a Grand Duchy. This status ended because the manifesto allowed the Tsar of Russia to rule Finland directly by edict, with disregard of the local constitution. The language manifesto would pass the following year, which replaced Finnish and Swedish with Russian as the language of administration and governance in Finland. However, Russian rule of Finland would end almost 20 years from these manifestos passing due to the Russian Civil War, so the Russification didn't occur as drastically as it would in other regions. Now let's briefly go over some effects of Romanov imperialism and Russification that can be seen today. The Russian Federation of today includes several republics, often populated by a specific minority group. On the map to the right, they are the purple regions. An example of a diaspora, as discussed during the Circassian genocide section, would be the Circassian diaspora. On the map of Russia, Circassians within the Federation often reside in the republics in the Caucasus, such as the Republic of Adygia. And lastly, diplomatic and political tensions between former subjects are partially rooted in imperialist and irredentist ideology rooted from the imperial area of Russia. However, some of the conflicts also stem from Soviet tensions, such as the frozen conflicts that occurred after the collapse of the USSR. Now, the summary. Romanov imperialist policy included Russification, which imposed the Russian language and culture onto non-Russians. The Orthodox Church, as part of the policies, would often be given influence and power over areas that followed other forms of Christianity or other religions, such as Islam. In some instances, Russia would encourage migration of other Christian minorities to new land, which would dilute the local population and achieve Russification via religion by making the Orthodox faith the majority in a region. Some effects of past imperialism can be seen throughout Eurasia. However, some of these effects were also influenced by the Soviet era. And here is my bibliography.